March 8th, 2025. Well, I've noticed on the X, I guess it's called now, certain people that generally are pretty sharp people, like Mike Lee of Utah Senator, and I've even seen Luna getting into this, and this is a very bad idea. It seems like the right wing always seems to fall into this thing, and they're like, well, we really they're having let's get out of UN and let's get out of NATO, and I'm like, this is completely nuts. And I can explain why this is nuts from the point of view of a very MAGA nationalist, I don't want to get involved in these globalist garbage at all attitude. And here's why. If we get out of the UN will become a weapon against the United States. It won't be just something that may cause us trouble once in a while or irritate us. It'll become an actual weapon. Why? Because we'll lose the veto in the Security Council, and then they can put international sanctions on the United States if they don't like what we're doing. And if you don't want to be participating in any UN activity at all, you don't want anything to do with anything UN at all. That's all well and good, but the way you don't want it being an international force against you either, which means that doesn't mean it just means that we shouldn't leave. We might stay in there and veto a lot of things. We might stay in there and not do much with it, but we want to be there and be there to stop them from doing anything we don't want them to do. Now, another thing to consider about this is, remember, the Soviet Union back in the day thought it was a good idea to boycott the Security Council. And when their friends, the North Koreans, invaded South Korea, they weren't there to veto the resolution that we got passed to create a UN force to go in and fight the North Koreans. Well, similarly, if we're not there, we won't be there to veto something against us. So that's the main reason on that. NATO, the same thing. If the United States were to leave NATO, unless it collapses, or even if it does collapse, what will those Europeans do on their own? What kind of trouble could they get in without us there to give them a little bit of, well, at any rate, I think it wouldn't be a good thing at all. And that doesn't mean we've got to go to war just because something happens. Remember, NATO doesn't compel us to actually go to war, actually. It really doesn't. We can always, one state can vote not to do anything. And, so that's the reason why those are both very bad ideas. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should, be happy about things there. It just means that we shouldn't leave. We should participate and maybe occasionally be a restraining factor under the Trump administration, unlike being the detrimental factor under the previous administrations, perhaps. Okay, if you like these videos, please give me a like, subscribe, and check the bell for notifications. Or you can follow me on the Rumble, which I post these there as well. Look in the address in the description below. So yeah, so that's kind of the way I think that people need to think about it. This is sort of emotional, raw stuff, but anything that's emotional and raw, don't go for it because it's generally a bad idea. So So at any rate, and now of course, as we're talking about it, on the other side of NATO, after all, who caused the whole problem anyhow? Well, actually, I think we did. I think the United States is the one that actually provoked this whole thing in Ukraine back in the period from 2008 all the way until the war broke out in 2022 by basically pushing increasingly to get more and more countries into NATO, and particularly Ukraine, and particularly talking about it when they weren't even eligible to be in NATO at the time because there are certain things about their internal situation that just didn't meet the standards. And the fact they had an ongoing conflict with the Russians actually, negated the admission idea, unless you decide to waive the rules, which had generally been the case for admitting people into NATO. So I think that's a point to consider. It's not to say that, of course, as always, that the Russians started shooting first. Of course, the Russians shot first. But remember, if you're being faced with a threat, you might strike first too in a self-defense situation. I mean, if somebody breaks in your house, for example, who says that you won't shoot before the criminal shoots, right? Now, if you do that in Massachusetts, you might be in real trouble, of course. But in states that have either a stand your ground or a castle doctrine, that's a whole different thing. So my point is, from the Russians' point of view, we were breaking into their security zone, and the coup in 2014 was a step too far for them. And we can debate, as I've said before, I think that the Russians probably miscalculated when they thought they could just rush in there and take over the place or impose the government they wanted. But that's why it happened, and it could have been prevented, as Trump keeps pointing out, simply by not doing what we did. Of course, the coup occurred before Trump was in office, so we don't know what he would have done about that if he'd have been in office. And when he was in there, I think he was continually being bullied by the Democrats and the, let's say, some of the internationalists, let's call them, into starting to provide weapons to Ukraine and all that, which, and of course, the British did too. And there was a lot of preparation, and all this got the Russians stirred up. And of course, when Biden showed weakness by the catastrophe and with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way it was carried out, I think they saw an opportunity. I've pointed this out before, but now Trump's got a problem, I think. I mean, he he tends to be very optimistic about his capabilities to do things in negotiations. I mean, remember his attempt to negotiate North Korea into giving up their nuclear weapons, for instance, because they could have beachfront hotels and stuff. That didn't quite. Sometimes I think he doesn't totally grasp the way other cultures may think about things. But anyhow, but right now, he's been trying to get Ukraine to participate, and Ukraine is not really participating yet, I don't think. They've said some of the right things after saying some of the wrong things, and then they're going back to saying some of the wrong things again. Meanwhile, we have our European friends trying to basically monkey wrench Trump's plan for negotiation in Ukraine. And I think that that's going on quite a bit too. You can notice that they're doing that. So, so there you have a situation. And now, of course, the other problem is going to be, which has been, mentioned before, is that is okay. Well, how's he dealing with the Russians? Well, the Russians may well be taking the opportunity of us trying to put pressure on the Ukrainians by withholding some targeting information and also some supplies and weapons. And so they're seeing this as an opportunity to escalate their activity, which is now, for instance, the latest has kind of annoyed Trump some. And yet he's threatening, well, if you keep this up, we're going to put some sanctions on you and some tariffs. And I'm like, tariffs? What do we buy from? What do we buy from Russia anyhow? Almost nothing anymore because of all the sanctions that have been put on by the previous administration under Biden. So there's very the trickle that exists now is things that we've not sanctioned because we actually need or want those things ourselves. It's to our advantage or the advantage of our NATO allies, of course. In other words, so I guess we can do some things. On the other hand, I think the Russians just blew up a lot of gas supplies that otherwise were going to go to the EU countries. So if we're going to sanction them from taking those supplies, the Russians just blew them up, didn't they? I mean, in other words, I don't know that if there's a complete trade boycott, if you want to call it whatever, I don't know that would really stop the Russians at this point. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think it's very likely it wouldn't. After all, I mean, what kind of trade did they have during World War II? I mean, really. And of course, we did supply a lot of weapons there. But then again, I don't know. It's a lot of trucks, particularly some tanks, some airplanes. But often they didn't use them quite the way we wanted. And a lot of the weapons we provided, some of the smaller ones, we actually provided eventually to the Chinese under Mao to help them run out the nationalists. So. And it's a complex issue, of course, but I think we should consider that that we sort of have he has a bit of a problem on his hands there. I think I don't know. It's hard to know what the Russians would agree to, because I mean, and then the problem is, can we get Ukraine to agree to what the Russians would agree to? I mean, they're very far apart right now in what they want. I mean, Russia wants territory they haven't even conquered yet. And that's been mentioned before. And the other thing is how much you can, while the Ukrainians want an alliance with other countries to protect them, I guess so that we would go to war with Russia if Russia breaks this deal that they make. On the other hand, Russia doesn't want them to have that kind of capability because they're afraid that they would reinitiate the war at a time and place of their own choosing. I mean, after all, Ukraine could probably use a respite now to rebuild their forces. And whereas Russia seems to be moving pretty well, I think, overall. There's fits and starts, but I think they're doing all right. So that's the situation we've got. And I think I know all the Democrats are now liberals, and even the certain people on the right are trying to basically attack Trump and saying that he's trying to sell out Ukraine. But I think basically he sees that Ukraine is losing anyhow. And so the best thing for them to do is to make the best deal they still could make before it gets completely out of hand. And if people push this too far, this could come up into, it clearly could become a much broader war and a much more dangerous one. I mean, some of the things that France is saying is almost irrational. I mean, France is going to become the nuclear guarantor of the NATO countries with their relatively small nuclear force. I mean, do they really plan on sacrificing France to save Ukraine? Is that really their plan? And also, but there is one point. The French and the British both have enough nuclear capability to damage Russia to the point that, well, of course, they would be annihilated in retaliation. It might be so great that Russia would basically launch a preemptive attack on our forces and the strategic forces, a World War III type attack, because they'd see they've been so weakened that that's the only way to rebalance the situation. That's a possibility that has to be considered there in that case. And that's why I think that it would be very smart to try to bring this to an end and save as much of Ukraine as possible. I think this, hopefully we can convince the Russians to minimize some of their territorial demands. I mean, after all, our idea of this pending and maybe to be approved, we're not sure yet, a minerals deal requires that the areas, some of the areas where the minerals are, remain under Ukrainian control. And certainly some of those mines are right around Potrovsk, which is still under attack right now. And as of late, the Russians are making some serious advances in that little enclave in Kursk that the Ukrainians carved out. They're advancing in the northern areas there by the, well, it's somewhat to the, I guess it would be east of Belgorod and south of Belgorod, that area up there, is it Osko River or something like that. They've crossed that and they are moving in that direction. They pretty much grabbed almost all of Luhansk, and they have a lot of Donetsk to still get. So this is the state of play at the moment, and I don't know, when the Russians are willing to stop. I mean, and that's going to be the problem. And I'm just looking at the situation with the idea of sanctions. I don't know that we have enough economic sanctions left to really change anything. The only thing I could see would be basically to sanction countries that trade with Russia, such as China and maybe India. But I mean, if we start sanctioning China, then we're going to be in a much more escalated trade war with China unless China just decides to abandon the support for Russia. But remember, they're really relying on Russia a lot for certain minerals and certain, not just minerals, but also oil. And I think they actually like the idea of the Russians and them allied as a strategic capability, which basically in some areas equals or exceeds the U.S.'s capability. So that's why I'm not sure that the Chinese are prepared to go that far. So at any rate, that's kind of the way I see the situation at the moment, and we'll, of course, keep everybody informed of what I think about it. I'm not as far over in this situation as people like the Daniel Davis on his deep dive show, or the people that often are on Judge Napolitano, but I certainly differ quite a bit from the Western perception of this thing. The other problem I do agree is that if we got, at the same time we're trying to stop this thing, if this is seen as weakness by the Russians, there's a danger that they'll overreact and take it too seriously. And that's a danger also. So we've got a mess on our hands, as I see it. So I wish Trump the best of luck in negotiating the end of this thing for the good of the world. And the way I'll of course, be posting this as always on YouTube and Rumble. And the addresses of my social media accounts are in the description below. And my general small comments I post most frequently on X, of course. So you can see me there too. It's a good place to also follow me there. Thanks a lot.